think I'm calm now. And to a point, I apologize. I get a little uppity when I talk about wealth inequality in this country. So I'll just leave it right there. I don't want to get fired or anything, but I have opinions. Um, I forgot to mention this, so pause this video and go watch How to Talk to Your Young Children About Economic and Social Class Differences. It's a video that I linked. It'll walk you through some of the symbolic interactionist take on this, where they will, um, I mean, how to talk to your kids about this, so that way your kids can understand what's going on. Because kids notice these things. Okay, kids, you'll see some young kids in that interview and they're young and they pick up on the fact that they're poor, that other people are poor, that some people are rich. Like, they get it. They're not dumb. And so this is how you can talk to them about it. So if you need to, pause here and welcome back. Let's jump into this. Now, again, please understand, I could talk on this topic for an entire semester and then some, as 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 you know, um, but I only get a week, and so most of it's done. And now I have to finish up with global inequality. Global inequality deserves its own month, um, but it's going to get one or two lectures. So, how did I get here? Your social class greatly impacts it. Your parents' education, your parents' income, your parents' job status impacts. You see that playing out. And you decide, even as a youngster, whether you want a life like they have or not. And so maybe the class you don't always see, but I would argue that you do. Um, but maybe you watch your parents and you're like, I don't want their job, but I want their life. And so that class distinction starts to play out for you too. And you see that. Let's do a little review before we jump into this stuff. So Jim works two jobs in order to pay rent and bills. Jim most likely belongs to which class? Well, obviously not upper, not middle. Um, I mean, for Jim, barely getting by, paying rent, bills with two jobs, he's probably part of the lower class, struggling to survive. That's what Jim has to do. Um, I mean, technically, the answer is true that the United States is an open system, but I have my own feelings about that. So go by the textbook definition, guys. Sure, it's an open system, even though we raise our kids to basically be us when they grow up. And we know, I mean, again, yes, there's some movement, but for 95% of the population, what your parents were class wise is what you're going to be class wise. Like, it just is. Um, so, whatever. Um, the caste system of India is an open system. This one is blatantly false. We know that's not. You watched the video on that. Caste system still exists today. I remember we had two seminarians from India when I was in SEM, and they would talk about how the untouchables and things like that is still very much a thing today, and how Christians oftentimes were the only ones reaching out to the untouchables and others over in Indian society. So it is still a thing. Don't get me wrong. Um, yeah, so it is what it is. What we're going to talk about, though, is the world global inequality right now. When it comes to global inequality, there are two main things. This comes right out of your textbook. So first off is Cold War terminology. Again, straight from your textbook on global inequality. During the Cold War, so the 80s, well, 60s, 70s, 80s, for you young folk, um, you split the world in the first and third world for the most part. First world, United States, Europe, Japan. First world, rich countries. Think of it that way. Um, Third world, Latin American countries, so Central and South American, a lot of your Asian countries, and your sub-Saharan African countries. So, excuse me, South African countries. There were those on the bubble countries. China is usually one that falls into that. The USSR would also fall into that because they weren't a first world, but they weren't exactly third world, so they're like somewhere in the middle. Um, it it's not vitally important. I'm just letting you know the terminology that existed. And I have no doubt that you've heard of first world countries before. You've heard of third world countries before. This is where that terminology came from. Cold War terminology. Um, oop. After that, we went to the world systems approach by this gentleman right here, Emmanuel Wallerstein, potentially Wallerstein. I don't know if he's like full on European German like that. It's based more on economies. And so instead of first world countries, well, now they're core countries. In order to be a core country, you had to be a capitalist society, whatever. You had to be industrial, you had to be technological, you had to be urbanized. So you had to be the US or Europe. I, you want to be a core country? US, Europe at this point in time. Semi periphery, those in between countries are not quite powerful enough, and yet they're just on the cusp of doing it. China, Mexico at that time. China now is probably a core country. Like if we're going to stop and think about this. But when this first came out, US would have been top. China, USSR would have been middle or semi periphery. And then you have the periphery countries. Little industrialization. Um, any factories that are there are owned by core nations. They're not actually owned by the people there. Very unstable governments. And so your book again lists Cuba, Venezuela, um, things like that, countries like that. So here you have your two approaches. You have your Cold War terminology, first versus third world, and so we can get away from rankings, even though you really didn't. You went to the world system approach, either your core or periphery, but really the same countries fell into the same buckets. It is what it is. Like, let's be honest about it. Um, in the global system, there are winners and there are losers. There are countries who have a lot, and there are countries who have nothing. Um, and that's just it. It is how the system is right now, no matter what you call it. It just is. I'll be back in a minute to talk a little bit more about this.